Tomorrow with a high 78. I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
Light rain, 72. Next news, 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by On Target Radio. From firearms and Second Amendment rights to personal freedoms and government intrusions. Listen here Sunday nights at 9.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So another tweet storm by Trump is making the left pop their heads off over the weekend and into today. The usual arguments, because any time Trump criticizes a black member of Congress, that's by definition racist. Anytime he refers negatively to a town that is majority minority, like Baltimore, that is inherently racist. And so here we are again with his tweets targeting Elijah Cummings, prompted, of course, by Elijah Cummings being one of those members of the House who continues to push for impeachment, despite Mueller's performance last week. Now, we've been here before with respect to Baltimore, as we have most urban centers that have substantial endemic violence and poverty problems, like when Bolshevik Bernie was there just 4 years ago, running for president the first time, and after meeting with Democrat political leaders in Baltimore, had a little presser and said this.
But anyone who took the walk that we took around this neighborhood would not think you're in a wealthy nation. You would think that you were in a third world country. But today what we're talking about is a community in which half of the people don't have jobs. We're talking about a community.
Why are you clapping?
In which there are hundreds of buildings that are uninhabitable. We're talking about a community where kids are unable to go to schools that are decent.
Bernie, would you say we're talking about a community where no one would choose to live? Because isn't that what Trump tweeted?
Yeah. That, and it's infested with rodents. No human being would want to live here. Mm-hmm. Very dangerous and filthy place. Worst in the USA.
Michelle, I don't know her last name. She's a resident of Elijah Cummings' district. She was interviewed by Kim Classic, who is a Baltimore County GOP Central Committeeman, and she's also a black female. And here's what Michelle had to say about Trump's tweets and Elijah Cummings' performance as her duly elected representative.
And people want to talk about Donald Trump this, Donald Trump that. Why is this man over there taking care of people at the border? We hungry. We need a place to stay. We feel like we're in a concentration camp. And it's just sad. He worried more about them than his own people. It's just crazy. Excuse me for venting like this, world, but it breaks my heart to see this. It does. This neighborhood, the last time this neighborhood was thriving was 2003. 2003. That's a long time ago.
Bernie Sanders, going back to Bernie on Baltimore in 2016, tweeted out, residents of Baltimore's poorest boroughs have lifespans shorter than people living under dictatorship in North Korea. That's a disgrace. Indeed it is. So who's been in charge of Baltimore for the last 50 years?
Well, they've had a string of mayors. Their new one, Mr. Young, responding. Mayor Young.
It is completely unacceptable for the president to attack a vibrant American city.
Yeah. And today, Baltimore's fighting back. They're having Al Sharpton come.
Because
that'll make things all better.
That's what you call fighting back? I ask again, who has been in charge of Charm City for the last 50 years?
Democrats.
Right. Just like the last 100 years in Chicago. And we have done, as Baltimore has done locally, what Bernie Sanders and the Democrat Socialists want to do nationally. And how's that going? In particular for minority communities. Is it not the case, would you not argue, based on the merits, the data, the evidence, the reality on the ground, that the people who are the most reliant on government in places like Baltimore and Chicago are the people who are suffering the most, the people who have the least in terms of quality of life, safety, opportunity, good schools? if what Trump's tweets do prompt this conversation, stripping away all the pieties and talking about reality in cities like Chicago on the west and south sides, and Baltimore, and at least some of Elijah Cummings' districts, maybe he's done a service. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Salena Zito, Washington Examiner reporter, New York Post columnist, CNN contributor, and the book, The Great Revolt Inside the Populist Coalition, Reshaping American Politics. Salena, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have an outside the Beltway perspective, which is why we always enjoy, one of the reasons we enjoy having you on all the time as a Pittsburgh denizen. And so, the D.C. press corps is, of course, aghast and is heaping moral scorn on the president. But how do you think this is received outside of the Beltway, where people actually have a pretty good idea what's going on in some neighborhoods in Baltimore and Chicago and L.A. and San Francisco and other urban centers around the country?
Well, I sort of remember during the president's inaugural speech where he said there is carnage in this country, and the chattering class sort of gasped.
He mentioned Chicago.
And what they miss is the fact that they don't go in places where there's carnage. It's not just in inner cities, it's also in the rural areas. And let's just take away sort of the crime, right? So crime tends to be the problem in the inner city, and drug overuse tends to be the problem in rural areas. But they're all causes of the conditions that their neighborhoods and communities have been left in. And since the 1930s, since FDR won, the New Deal coalition formed, large cities in this country have become completely one-party rule. And when you have that, there is corruption, there is ignorance, and there is this sense that it doesn't matter what their community looks like, they're always going to vote for me. I'm always going to get their vote because I'm going to promise them things. And when you, hand out free things, people lose the desire to earn things. And then that's part of, certainly not all of, but part of what happens in the decline of communities.
Well, I don't think what Trump tweeted was racist, but mainstream media does, and that seems to, be taking away from President Trump's winning narrative. I mean, do you think anything that he's doing is a little bit juvenile with tweeting?
So, Trump is always going to throw a Molotov cocktail out into the Twitterverse every day. That's just who he is. And if our profession hasn't figured it out yet, and that he plays them a lot, then they are not paying attention to a pattern of behavior. And instead, the pattern of behavior becomes he says something, everybody's shocked. I would strongly argue that reporters and pundits and, the people that we elect to office get out there every day and not only observe and understand what's going on, but to listen to their constituents and have real life problem solving, not just throwing money at a problem to make it go away. I see this problem all across the country. I'm on a drive right now, actually heading towards Chicago.
Turn back. Turn back.
Well, you know me. I only take back roads, so
Yep.
I'm taking US 20, then I'm going down around Gary and then over to Wisconsin. So I'll see you sort of. Look. People that live in these communities, whether it's a rural carnage or whether it's an urban carnage, will honestly tell you, yeah, man, our town's a mess. If it's a city, they're like, look at this garbage, look at this crime. I don't want to take my kids outside. I'm afraid to send my kids to school. And you find that in the city areas. When you get to the rural areas, and parents are terrified that their kid will be the next statistic in the heroin and fentanyl and meth that is sort of addictions that are sweeping our rural areas. We've got a large problem.
Well, I mean, President Trump now should go after Congressman Danny Davis. Numbers just came in: 48 people shot this weekend, 8 killed. That's just this weekend alone.
Yeah, that's unacceptable.
There's no political points to be scored talking that story. And I mean, look, if the D.C. press corps didn't have Trump's Twitter account, I don't know what they'd spend 24 hours reporting on, honestly. And to that point, this piece by Arthur Brooks bothers me. And I wanted to see if you're always my a barometer for sort of the regular hardworking Americans who don't pay attention to all of the bloviations from politicians and how they receive this stuff. Brooks's piece in Washington Post, you're probably making incorrect assumptions about your opposing political party. And he makes the point, only 22% of U.S. adults are on Twitter. 80% of the tweets come from 10% of the users. If you rely on Twitter for political information, you're being informed by ersatz pundits residing within 2.2% of the population. Right. That's true. I get it.
I wrote that a year and a half ago.
Right. And so I totally get that Twitter is distortive, that it's the extremes and it's the vulgar and the profane and the ill-informed and all that. Here's the problem I have with Brooks, who the phrase housebroken mascot of conservatism comes to mind with him. It's, yes, we may have a distorted view of people who disagree with us, regular people, not part of the political milieu. But I think he and so many center-right conservatives, including some intellectuals, have a wildly distorted, underappreciated view of how extreme those 10% of Twitter users are, the left version of them, and where the real energy is in the Democrat Socialist Party. Like, they don't really believe this stuff, or we'll be able to work with them, or we'll be able to find points of intersection. I mean, there are mutually exclusive choices that are being presented in the 2020 election with most of the 2020 Democrat presidential candidates vis-a-vis Trump. And I just feel like those that are inside the Beltway and want to be invited to the right cocktail parties, even if they're a center-right perspective, vastly underestimate and distort the danger, if you are not a subscriber to socialism, that is being pursued by the left.
Wow, that was the longest question I've
I know. Sorry,
congratulations,
but I had to make
Dan.
the argument.
You did it.
Okay.
I can't just say, do you like Arthur
Where's
Brooks?
your answer?
Yeah.
I know.
Yes or
right?
no?
Okay. In short, the elite in Washington, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are still completely wildly disconnected with people outside of Washington. And I would say that for both sides. I would say Republican establishment types in Washington have more in common with their liberal peers than they do with people, that live outside of Washington. This is why I've long argued that the political parties in this country, which are, by the way, just caving, should be located in Cleveland and Columbus as opposed to Washington, D.C. They don't know anybody like you or me or people that are listening to the show. They know people like them, and they are much more wedded to institutional dominance as opposed to being more speculative of what institutions are prescribing as fixes for the country.
And so
did that answer that?
It does. And so all
Good
of
job.
and you're much more succinct than I am. But that's why you get paid to do all this stuff, write books and whatnot. But here's the thing. So all of that, the introspection that was going on, and some reporters getting out after the Trump shock wore off and getting out into the hustings and talking to people to try and understand them, and all that's over, right? All that is, everybody's back to base camp, and the elites in charge of all of the cultural and civic institutions in this country have learned nothing from what happened in 2016.
Right. First of all, because they approached it wrong. How did they approach it? They parachuted in, spent a day there, looked at the most oddest person, and decided that's the story. Now, in journalism, you tend to look at someone who's different, that stands out. That's part of your instinct, right? But to parachute in means that you missed everything that's happening going into that community. So why is this community like this? You don't know because you only went to one place, and that's there's sort of a danger in assessment when not having a broader perspective about what's going on in a community that caused it to get to this place.
She is Salena Zito, Washington Examiner reporter, New York Post columnist, CNN contributor. The book, The Great Revolt: Inside the Populist Coalition Reshaping